The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the deserted streets as Arya walked home from school. Her usual route took her through the outskirts of the city, a forgotten neighborhood where the houses stood abandoned, their windows shattered like empty, soulless eyes. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and neglect, and the only sounds were the distant caws of crows and the occasional rustle of dry leaves skittering across the cracked pavement. Arya quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing eerily in the oppressive silence. The old, overgrown trees that lined the street seemed to close in on her, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. She passed by the dilapidated playground, its rusted swings creaking softly in the wind, and the boarded-up convenience store, its sign hanging askew, covered in layers of grime and graffiti. The place had a history, a dark one, whispered among the locals, but never openly discussed. People vanished here, and those who ventured after dark often spoke of seeing strange figures and hearing disembodied voices. As Arya walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, her breath catching in her throat as she caught sight of a figure in the distance. It was a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp, blood-stained teeth. Panic surged through Arya as she quickened her pace, but the man's strides lengthened, effortlessly matching her speed. The streetlights flickered and dimmed, casting the world in a murky, sepia tone. Shadows danced around her, playing tricks on her eyes. Every sound was amplified in the silence: the crunch of gravel underfoot, the rustle of leaves, the distant drip of water. She passed the old, abandoned house at the corner, its once grand facade now crumbling and overtaken by ivy. It was said to be haunted, a place where unspeakable horrors had occurred. The house seemed to watch her with malevolent intent, its dark windows like eyes following her every move. Her heart pounded in her chest as she heard a faint, ghostly whisper. Arya. Her name, drawn out in a sibilant hiss, sent a jolt of terror through her. She stumbled, her legs feeling like lead, and tried to break into a run. The man was closer now, his presence an oppressive weight pressing down on her. She veered into an alley, hoping to lose him, but the darkness there was almost tangible, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. The alley was narrow and claustrophobic, lined with towering brick walls that seemed to close in on her. Graffiti-covered dumpsters and piles of rotting garbage added to the sense of decay. The only light came from a single, flickering bulb above a rusty door, casting long, sinister shadows. As she pressed deeper into the alley, she could hear the man's labored breathing growing louder, closer. Arya's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but all she found were dead ends. The alley was a maze of shadows and despair. Her skin prickled as she felt a cold, clammy hand brush against her shoulder. She spun around, her scream caught in her throat, but there was no one there. Instead, a putrid stench filled the air, the unmistakable scent of rotting flesh. She gagged, her eyes watering as she stumbled backward, tripping over something soft and yielding. She looked down to see a lifeless body, its eyes wide open and mouth frozen in a silent scream. The realization hit her like a sledgehammer. She was in a dumping ground for the dead, the forgotten victims of the man who now stalked her. Desperation clawed at Arya as she scrambled to her feet, but it was too late. The man was upon her, his skeletal fingers wrapping around her wrist with a vice-like grip. His touch was ice cold, sending waves of nausea through her. "Join them," he whispered, his voice a rasping hiss. She struggled, but his strength was inhuman. He dragged her toward a gaping maw of darkness at the end of the alley, where the shadows seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. Her screams echoed into the void as the darkness swallowed her whole. The last thing she saw was the man's face, his hollow eyes gleaming with a sick, twisted pleasure. In the inky blackness, she felt herself being pulled apart, piece by piece, her body and soul consumed by the malevolent force that dwelled within the shadows. The alley returned to its eerie silence, the only sound the faint whisper of her name carried on the wind. "Arya!"